Welcome back, Digital Crew. Today's video has to do with Chapter 3, Ecosystem Ecology. So let's start off with what is an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a particular location on Earth distinguished by its particular mix of interacting biotic, living, and abiotic components. Of course, this should be a review of living environment from last year, where you were talking about all of these different terms already, with abiotic and biotic being part of this picture, right? We've got producers, which are the biotic. You've got the primary consumer, secondary consumer, all terms that are going to come up again now that we're going to go into food webs and also with food chains. But here we can also see that there are the abiotic, right? Water, precipitation, carbon dioxide, oxygen. So when you take all these things together, that is going to give us our ecosystem. Some other terms that will be helpful: species, a group of similar organisms whose members freely interbreed, and that last part's very important. I have to look this up. Somebody was mentioning that ligers can interbreed now, but I gotta fact check that one. But how about mules, right? You breed a horse and a donkey, it gives you the strong mule, but those are not a species because they can't interbreed and create viable offspring. However, dogs are one species, and it doesn't matter what breeds you have, they are all still the dog species, right? So you could have, anything you could think of with two dog breeds and make those weird mixes. You could make husky chihuahuas and call it something silly. Huskwawas. I don't know. You'll probably think of some other funny ones too. But the point is that species can all interbreed and they are all similar. Okay? Population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area at the same time. The community is all of those different populations in an area, and then an ecosystem is that community with all the abiotic factors included. This brings us to our next term, ecosystem boundaries. So some ecosystems are very clearly and easily defined, like caves and lakes. Right? With a cave, you've got that opening in the front, and that is really the entrance exit. Same thing with a lake. You know where the edges of that body of water are. So it's very easy to clearly define where these things start and end. But when you have something like a forest that's maybe intermingled with some grasslands, and maybe there are some parts where trees have grown out or grass has kind of found a little place inside of a group of trees, it's really hard to say where that ecosystem starts and ends. There are also some very, very big size differences between ecosystems. Here we can see the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which if you look at the scale, this little bit right here is 50 kilometers. So this is enormous. And also, someone could probably argue that this dotted line maybe should be moved around a little bit, right? It's a little fuzzy as to what exactly makes up that ecosystem. Here, inside of this knot of a tree, you can see this small pool of water that has grown, and this is also an ecosystem, right? It has things that are different than the outside. And where these ecosystems do touch, we have the term ecotones. So going back to the example of the cave, the mouth of the cave is the ecotone. If you go into the cave, you're in the cave. If you go out of that opening in the front, well, then you're wherever that spills into, maybe hills, maybe a forest. So that would be the ecotone, that clear or hopefully semi-clear area where two ecosystems are interacting. So another part of ecosystems has to do with energy. Energy goes into each different part of the circle of life, and everything is going to either get transferred into the next organism that eats something, or it will just be let out as heat. But we need to talk a little bit more about the specifics of thermodynamics so that we can really get a better idea of energy at large within the ecosystem. So thermodynamics, study of energy and its transformations. You'll remember from one of the chapters, 1 or 2, that energy is not created or destroyed, it is simply transformed from one form of energy to another. So we need to talk about energy in these systems because they are transforming. They're transforming from the sunlight going into the leaves, turning into sugar, which is then eaten by something else, and that could be expelled as heat, right? It's all just being transformed. But we do also want to take a look at that energy within each system which is the object, or for environmental science, we could think of it like the area in terms of a system. It's what's being studied. So there are two types of systems: closed systems and open systems. Open systems have flow. There are exchanges between the area that you're looking at and the outside. And with a closed system, you're not going to have that exchange. That is hard to find because most things have some way of transferring energy. Even a completely encased in concrete building, right? You just totally take out any way that you think heat can really leak through or out through, like gas or electric or anything like that. Well, concrete or any other material that you would build around to try and seal this thing is going to let energy go through it. So it's very, very difficult to get a closed system on Earth, and we really don't find it. So going back to energy, we need to talk about two huge processes: photosynthesis and respiration. So let's start with the producers, who are going to be autotrophs. Again, words you should have remembered from last year. These are able to use the sun's energy to produce usable energy through the process called photosynthesis, which at the bottom you can read solar energy plus 6H2O, water, plus 6CO2, carbon dioxide, is going to give you C6H12O6, glucose, which is a simple sugar, and 6O2, oxygen gas. You should be very, very familiar with this process. And yes, we also do capture some sunlight and make our own energy with solar panels. The flip of this process of photosynthesis is respiration. It's the exact same equation, just flipped, as you see on the bottom. So it's the exact same thing, just in a different order. Or here you can see that the arrow has turned from going to the right to going to the left. And respiration is performed by all organisms, including plants. And we will be looking at that a little bit later to take into account how energy works with them, since they're not only storing energy in the glucose, but they're also breaking it down to get energy. So if you're not doing photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, which we'll get to in a moment as well, you would be a consumer. You are going to be obtaining energy by eating or consuming other organisms. Primary consumers are going to be eating the producers, hence primary. They're the first ones that are going to be consuming another organism. Then you've got the secondary, which eats those, and then you have the tertiary, which eats those. This brings us to food chains and food webs. So a food chain is the sequence of consumption from producers through tertiary consumers. This is a single link of a web. You could think of it like that. It starts off with that producer and just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, in a chain. A food web is much more realistic, and it is made up of these food chains. And the cool part is that it can interlink and have some interesting things happen between all of the different chains that are wrapping around and perhaps intermingling in odd ways. So this, for example, is a food chain. This is a terrestrial food chain, right? These are all things on the left that are going to be living on land. And it just simply goes grasses as the producer, zebra as the primary consumer, and then the lion as the secondary consumer. On the right, you see an aquatic one where you have algae being the producer, zooplankton as the primary, fish as the secondary, and bald eagle as the tertiary. The other cool part about these different labels is if there was something in between the zebra and the lion, say a hyena eats the carcass of the zebra and then the lion eats the hyena, something like that, you could have the lion also count then as a tertiary. And you can actually see that here in this food web. You can see that the hyena itself has 3 different labels. It is a primary consumer, it is a secondary consumer, it's a scavenger, and you can see all of these different arrows coming from grass going out to the detritivores, decomposers, all the different levels of consumers. And it does get a little crazy. Now this is actually pretty simple compared to what you might imagine in a swamp or a rainforest, where there's so many different species with so many different niches and things that eat and things that eat them. It can get extremely complex. So sometimes it is nice to take a chain out of this and just look at that, but it is also nice to see the whole picture if it's not too crazy to look at.